another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, send them to comment@am950radio.com. So for this week's show, I'm going to be doing the 15th Amendment. We'll start out with that. I wasn't able to do it last week because of all the things going on. So I'm putting it in this week. And then the second segment, I'm going to talk about a housing forum, which is like basically another town hall format, like I talked about on last show. This time it was about housing in particular, and there were some senators there and a city council member, so I'm going to talk about my experience there. And then the third segment is going to be about some elections, some special elections that happened. So again, I'm taping this Wednesday at 11 o'clock, so some of the numbers that I might give out for the election results might change, when all the votes get counted, but, just roughly in the general vicinity. But that'll be the third segment for today's show. So let's start out with the 15th Amendment as we continue continue our journey through the Constitution. So this is the third Civil War Amendment, basically. This is a series, as I talked about before, where for about the 5 years after the Civil War, there were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed that dealt with African Americans now being free after the Civil War and giving them some increased rights. So the 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3rd, 1870. So, it's been almost 5 years after the end of the Civil War. So this relates to voting. This was another one of the amendments that was proposed by 2/3 of Congress. So I talked before about how under Article 5 of the Constitution, one of the ways to propose amendments is that 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate pass a proposed amendment, which they did here in the 15th Amendment, and then 3/4 of the states need to ratify the proposed amendment. So enough of the states ratified it on February 3rd, 1870, so that's when it took effect. So this was after Ulysses Grant was elected president in 1860, so, you definitely still have some of the, main people involved in the Civil War. A lot of them went into politics afterwards, both on the north side and the south side. And so this is a time when Grant was president, so he was in favor of this particular amendment. So this was brought up by the Republicans in Congress. Remember back then the Republicans, or sometimes they were called the Radical Republicans, were the party that were wanting to get rid of slavery, right? That's one of the things Lincoln ran on. So it passed Congress on February 26, 1869. So it took about a year to get enough states to ratify the amendment. So here's what it says. Broken into two sections, two short ones. Section 1 is the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that's Section 1. Section 2 then says, as the previous two amendments did, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So this is a pretty short one compared to, the 14th Amendment that I did previously, where that's a long one. And I only did two sections because it was so long. So Section 2 is, similar to the 13th and 14th Amendments, where Congress has the power to do these things. Again, because the state governments, particularly in the South, were part of the problem. We're denying rights to African Americans, so Congress bypassed basically the state governments here. So let's look at Section 1 a little more closely. It says that it starts out saying the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied. Okay, so that part in here, some people think that the Constitution, by that those wording there, says that basically we have a right to vote in the United States. That's not how it's been looked at by the courts. We don't have a right to vote. If we did have a right to vote, then we wouldn't have all these voter suppression laws going on. And we wouldn't have the Republicans doing all the things that they're trying to do to keep people from voting if we actually had a right to vote, a full-fledged right to vote. But we don't have that. So there's a movement to try, and get that, like specifically add that in as an amendment to the Constitution, or at least into federal law, which is one of the things that the John Lewis Voting Act tried to do when the Democrats were in power after the 2020 election, but Sinema and Manchin screwed that over again, so we weren't able to get that. So, but what this does say, though, is that the United States itself, so the federal government, cannot do anything to deny citizens the right to vote. So here again, notice that it says the word citizens. It doesn't. So people that are not citizens cannot vote. We've gone through that before in previous shows, despite that the Republicans are saying there's millions of illegals voting. That's not the case. You have to be a citizen to vote. But the United States itself, in other words, the federal government, can't deny citizens the right to vote, nor can any state under this amendment, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the previous condition of servitude part is, again, we talked previously in the 13th Amendment, it talks about indentured servitude, right? Basically working as part of your punishment for some prison sentence, or to pay off a debt, stuff like that. That's what involuntary servitude is. So you can't, under this amendment, deny a person their right to vote there. Again, assuming that they are citizens. So, the states control most of the election laws in their states, which is one reason why it put in there in Section 2, Congress has the power to take care of, enforce the 15th Amendment here. So, this is why we see voter ID laws, right? The people in probation in some states can't vote. Minnesota used to have that, but we changed that. You have to have certain documents to register to vote, all of these certain things, right? Like you can't give food or drink to people standing in line to vote, all these different things they can try and do, because the 15th Amendment does not give us just everybody a right to vote, period, if you're a citizen. So basically the idea here was, at least at that point in time, was to give the freed slaves who were citizens, remember, under the 14th Amendment, they became citizens, if they were born in the United States, and by that time they were, because the foreign slave trade had been abandoned, right? So, a couple other things about Section 1. Notice that it doesn't say anything about women. Okay, that didn't happen until 1920, under the 19th Amendment, where women got the right to vote in federal elections. Now, some states had allowed it prior to that, but they couldn't vote in federal elections. You could only vote in state elections. At that point in time, because I was just curious about this, about how many states in the North allowed freed slaves to vote at this time, because again, states could control their own voting laws. So some states had, the freed slaves could vote, the males, and there were only 8 of them at that point by the time that this election was ratified. So you could see why there was this push to get this amendment through, because even in the North, there was only 8 states that allowed freed slaves to vote at that time. So, but of course, southern states found ways around this amendment. Right? You've probably heard of the Jim Crow laws, where after the 18 1976 presidential election, the Union pulled out the Army. That was part of the deal to get the Republican to be president. And that's when you started seeing a lot of the southern states pass all kinds of laws denying freed slaves the right to vote, or black people the right to vote. Some of the things that they did were poll taxes, where you had to pay a certain amount of money before you could vote. You know, the assumption here was that a lot of black people were too poor to pay this poll tax, and a lot of them were. So that stopped a lot of them from voting. This also kept some of the poor white people from voting too, though. But at that point, the Democratic Party, remember back then, they were the ones that were in the South. They still had enough numbers to win, even if the poor white people couldn't vote because of the poll tax. Another thing they did was a literacy test, right, where if you didn't pass it, you couldn't vote. So many blacks were illiterate back then because, they didn't have get an education. Or the test was really hard for them as opposed to the white people, because the person there, at the election area could determine what test to give out. So, of course, they gave the real hard ones out to the black people, and they gave the real easy ones out to the white people. And if the poll worker wasn't satisfied with the black person's answer, then they just denied him. So there was a scene in the movie Selma, which, by the way, I recommend that you watch, where Oprah Winfrey's character, she went in to go vote. And at that point in time, they gave her a literacy test. And she answered the first couple questions that were asked of her, much to the surprise of the white poll worker that was there. So then one of the questions he asked her was, give the number of county judges in Alabama at that time. And she knew the answer to that. She said 67. Then, in order to stop her from voting, the white poll worker says, okay, name them all. And, of course, she couldn't do it. So she was denied her right to vote, and she left. So stuff like that was going on until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. So there's all kinds of stuff going on in the South to deny black people the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. You even had laws down in the South where, well, if your grandfather was, able to vote, you could vote. So, of course, that helped the white people, but it didn't help the black people. Because their grandfathers couldn't vote. Probably their fathers even couldn't vote at that point in time. Right? So, they were just doing all kinds of tricky things to get around this amendment. And the federal government at that time wasn't, down there. The Army was gone by then. And so, it was tough. Until at least after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But it's still tough. Let's face it. So where is this kind of going since then? Well, the Supreme Court initially actually allowed these literacy and poll taxes, saying that if it was race neutral, in other words, if you applied this to the white people as well as the black people, it was okay. But this was later overturned by the Supreme Court in 1949, so it took that long for the Supreme Court to say, no, in this case involved the state of Alabama, one of their laws, was intended to clearly deny voting to black people. So it wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which banned the literacy tests and the poll taxes and the grandfather clause and other such things. But John Roberts and the Supreme Court have thrown out various portions of that law now, and this has led to more voter suppression laws being passed in Republican states. Now you're going to see Congress, at least there's an attempt by the Republicans in Congress now that they have the House and the Senate, are going to play around with voting rights laws again. I've mentioned that on a previous show. They're trying to pass laws where if you've changed your name from your birth certificate, you can't vote or renew your registration unless you have the official original document to prove your name change. Stuff like that is going on. So the Supreme Court just heard a case involving Voting Rights Act again, which is called Louisiana versus Calais. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Callais. It looks like the 6 Republicans on the court are looking for a way to gut the act even more, the 1965 Civil Rights or the Voting Rights Act, allowing more gerrymandered maps. So this involved the Louisiana legislature had drawn some maps. They were challenged. The federal judges said, no, you gotta have 2 majority black congressional districts instead of 1, which the Republicans were trying to do. Since blacks are a third of the population in Louisiana, there's 6 House seats in Louisiana. So the judges down there said you got to have 2 black congressional districts that have a majority of black people in them. So that case is now in front of the Supreme Court. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Supreme Court said, nah, you don't have to have 2. So they just had an oral argument on that a few weeks ago. So, this is the Roberts court is the one that said, well, there's no discrimination, occurring anymore. So they got rid of the federal pre-clearance requirements from the law in an earlier case. And even in this oral argument, Alito just said that, well, the lower district court decision is simply wrong. The states can decide it on its own. Right, so here again is Alito. It's like, man, why isn't that guy impeached for some of the stuff that he's saying, let alone his decision, but just some of the stuff that he's saying on the court. All right, so that's the 15th Amendment. So that's the one where the freed black men at that time were allowed to vote. But it took a lot for them to vote, as I mentioned. So hopefully next week we'll try the 16th Amendment. So we'll see you on the other side of the break with another town hall type segment.
See me right out of that sunset. Here come the jesters.
All right, welcome back to the second segment of this week's show of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. All right, so for this segment, I'm going to talk about another, basically a town hall experience that I had over the weekend. So this was actually a housing forum, and that was at my church, and some local groups that are advocating for more affordable housing, came together, and we had this housing forum, and there were some local officials there. So it was basically a town hall, but with a emphasis on housing. That was the main thing that was being talked about. All right, so this is another opportunity to talk with the elected officials about this particular issue when you have some of these forums where you could just focus it on one particular thing rather than all kinds of different things going on. So this is a chance for them because we let we had 3 elected officials. We let them talk. We let them give their views on some of these things. And in particular, this was about affordable housing and how local zoning laws are kind of preventing more affordable housing laws from coming into being in the Twin Cities area. So there were about 62 or so people at the forum, so at least the room that we had at the church was basically full. Which is another good sign where you get a lot of people are involved in things like these. So the 3 politicians that we had there were State Senator Jim Carlson. He's from Senate District 52, so he's from the Eagan area, and he's on the State and Local Government Committee in the Senate, which handles some of the zoning laws issues, so that's one reason why he was there. The second one was State Senator Lindsay Port. She represents District 55, which is from the Burnsville area. And she's actually the chair of the Housing and Homelessness Prevention Committee in the Senate. So, and she has introduced on her own some housing-related bills in the Senate. So she gave one of the longer presentations about, she talked about some of the bills that she's proposing, some of the challenges around affordable housing, which I'll get to here in a little bit. But so she was the second one. And the third one was Inver Grove Heights City Council member Mary Tkach was there. And she talked a little bit about how the housing issue is at the city government level. So we had two people from the state legislature, the state senate, talk, and then someone from the city government. So we got a perspective from both of those different levels of government. So the forum lasted a bit over 90 minutes. It was scheduled for 90 minutes, and we went a little bit over, which is not surprising because the politicians talked, a little longer than they were given time for. But that's a good thing. I mean, the people there wanted to hear from these people. That's one reason why you show up at these forums or town halls, is you want to hear the elected politicians talk. So I was actually the timekeeper at this forum, and I let them go a little bit longer. But it was fine. It wasn't too long after the 90 minutes. So a lot of the people there were people, as I mentioned before, who are advocating for more affordable housing and, housing for homeless people and housing for veterans, for example. There was an individual there that was one of his main focuses, and he talked about some of the issues that he's seen. And not only could you ask them questions during or after they presented, we had a little bit of time where some people asked questions from the audience, but they also, all three of them, stayed after the forum was over, and I was able to talk to two of them afterward, 2 out of the 3. So I was able to talk with Senator Port, and I actually hope to have her on a future show. It might not be until after the session's over. We'll see. But she's willing to come on the show. So, I had not met her before, but, I talked to her, and I talked to her legislative assistant who was with her, who I also hope to have on a future show, where I'm going to try and get some of the legislative assistants on, and they can give you some ideas of what their job is at the Capitol. So I talked with her, and I talked with Mary Tkach, the city council member at Inver Grove Heights, about this. I was going to try to talk to Carlson, but there were just too many people around him, and we had to leave the church at a certain time, and so I wasn't able to talk to him. But I have talked to him before about some other things, because he comes to these forums quite often. So, but I was kind of listening in a little bit on his conversations, while I was standing around afterwards. So, so this is a chance, again, for people. I know that I don't want to get involved in politics, and they don't really listen to me and all this stuff. Well, if you don't go, if you don't show up, yeah, they're not going to listen to you. So you got to make the choice to get involved here, and this is a simple way. It took 90 minutes out of your day, right? And you're able to hear what these people are thinking about some of these various, in this case, housing bills and some of the problems. So this is a way for you to get involved and get some face time with your representatives, or representatives might not be in your particular district, but are in the general vicinity. And you might be surprised, how much they remember about their conversations with people at these forums or town halls. So, don't be afraid to approach these people. That's why they stay afterwards, most of them. And yeah, there's going to be people that go right towards them, and you might have to wait a while to get to talk to them, but that's okay. They want to hear from you. That's one reason why they're there. They wouldn't be there otherwise. So I can't stress enough how this direct interaction really makes a difference. So take some time out of your day at some point and go to some of these things, whether it's a forum on housing or a forum on an issue that is significant to you, or if it's just a regular town hall like I talked about on last week's show. Or you can get more involved in your local party, like you can get involved in the DFL party. Go to their meetings, run for some of the offices they have there, right? This is a way you can make a difference. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit to kind of tell you some of the things that came up at the forum and some of the numbers. I kept track of some of the numbers that were brought up, and so I'm going to just give you a few of these to start with, and then mix in some of the stuff that was talked about here. So the first one is $540,000 is the median selling price for a new home in Minnesota. Median being like the average selling price. $540,000. So could you buy a house right now, a new house for $540,000? Now keep in mind, this is the median price. This isn't the high price houses in Minnesota. So this kind of gives you an idea right off the bat how unaffordable new housing is to a lot of people in the state of Minnesota, and probably in other states for that matter. $540,000 is the median selling price for a new house in Minnesota. Now that price is going to go up because of the tariffs Trump is putting on, in particular Canada, because we get a lot of lumber from Canada to build these new houses, and those prices are going to go way up after these taxes are, well, some of them already are, but he's going to put more on them. So that $540,000 number, I think, is going to go up pretty soon. So here's another one in Minnesota. So this is statewide. Minnesota has 87 counties. Okay, none of the counties have median income jobs that can afford that new house, that $540,000. None of them, have enough people that make that median income job, $540,000, enough to buy that new house. I mean, you would think that, well, maybe some of the rich suburbs do. Well, there's lots of poor people in the rich suburbs too. I'll get back to that later, which is one of the problems for getting affordable housing in the suburbs. But that was another number that kind of jumped out at me. And in 1950, it was easier for a black person to own a home than it is today. Now, I bought my first home when I was 31. But now, the median age for someone to buy their first house is in Minnesota, 38. That number's been going up. So the median age is going up. The median price to buy the house is going up, and to build the house is going to go up. Right? And the ability to make those payments is getting harder for people. Particularly those with high debt already, one of the main areas there is people with a lot of student loan debts. I mean, you're a student loan when you're done with 4 years, some of the 4-year schools, or if you go into grad school or law school like I did. I mean, you already got a mortgage payment by the time you're out of school, right? So a lot of those people can't buy a house. So they rent. I'll get to rent here in a little bit. Rent is obviously getting a lot higher too. So Minnesota is short about 100,000 homes so that everybody has a place to live in the state of Minnesota. So we're about 100,000 short I'll circle back to that here in a little bit too. Eviction filings have increased 50% from the pre-COVID average. So remember when COVID hit, there were some laws passed that said, you can't kick people out because they don't have a job now, they don't have enough income. So even now that stuff has now been dropped off. So the eviction filings, meaning people getting kicked out of their rental units, whether it's an apartment or housing, has gone up 50% from what the average was before COVID hit. On any given night, there's nearly 20,000 people who are homeless in the state of Minnesota. 20,000. Building in the suburbs, of course, is where we're seeing this big increase in new housing. And when that is where the new building is going on, as opposed to in the cities or the inner cities, this increases the number of people driving, right? The drive time. There's more damage to the roads, all of those things that come with extra people driving on the roads. Not to mention the increase in pollution. All right, so this definitely not only has this housing issue is a problem with people getting houses, but it's also a problem for climate change. Right? Now, one of the main obstacles to get more affordable housing is the local zoning laws in the cities and out in the counties. If you live out in the county and you don't live in a city limits. Now, in the state of Minnesota, the Met Council, Metropolitan Council, it's called Met Council for short, sets the affordable housing numbers around the state. Problem is, though, they can't really enforce those numbers. So one of the statistics that someone mentioned was that there was only 14% of the cities in the state are actually following the numbers set by the Met Council for their particular city. 14%. So that's another problem. And why is there this big problem? Well, zoning is the main one, and it basically boils down to what's called NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y, not in my backyard. Right, that's what's going on. Some of the claims here as well, affordable housing is going to drive down their property values, and it's going to raise crime rates. We don't want the minorities to come live in our neighborhood, right? You're going to increase turnover in the neighborhoods, which is also going to drive down property values. And, we can't have that in our suburbs. And in a lot of the zoning laws, like you have to have bigger yards. You have to have more parking spots. You have to have bigger, parking lots if you're having building apartments. Some cities actually have a ban on building duplexes and townhomes to keep affordable housing out of their cities. So what you're seeing now is these housing advocates are now trying to get the state of Minnesota to do something because the cities are not. All right, so that's why Lindsey Port's bringing some of these bills in the Senate. Now, I'm not really expecting that those bills are going to pass in the Senate, let alone the House, because just the numbers. Like the DFL has a slim advantage in the Senate and it's tied in the House, so I'm not expecting these things to pass. But you got to keep trying. You got to keep the pressure on, which is another reason why you come to these meetings. Lindsey Port's trying to propose some changes that change some of these zoning laws so that it's harder to segregate. What's wrong with those? But, people, at least right now, I suspect, will vote against it if it comes to the floor. And I don't even think they might not even get it out of committee. But you still try. You still put the pressure on. So big business, of course, opposes these proposals, as do the private equity firms who are going around buying up housing now. And then they, fix them and they turn them into rentals and they jack up the price for rentals, or they jack up the price to sell it. Again, one of the reasons why they're here, why are they in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and some of the suburbs? Well, because we have that $100,000 home shortage in our state. So there's certainly, in their minds anyway, a market to be doing this. Otherwise they wouldn't be here. But they're here. Around the suburbs, more rental housing is going up than new homes. If you drive around Eagan, you drive around Inver Grove Heights, you go around Woodbury area. There's a lot of apartment buildings being built. And rental homes. Not new homes to sell, but rental homes. And they're not very affordable. And what happens is you're going to get older and older population in your city because those are the only people, that can afford these prices. Young people aren't coming in. So what are you going to do? What's going to happen to your city when these older generations die off? And, the younger generation isn't there. All right? This is one of the issues that is popping up. So you got to keep pushing, though. And that's what this forum was about. You can't win if you can't push. And if we get bigger numbers for the DFL in the legislature after the 2026 elections, maybe some of these things have a chance. So this is another reason why to get involved in politics more. You got a little more control over your life. All right, so that's it for that segment. So when we come back, I'm going to talk about some of the election results from last night. Talk to you then. All right, welcome back to the third and final segment of this week's Politics Matter show, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So I'm doing this segment kind of on, at least initially here, on the special elections that occurred last night. So again, I'm taping at around 11 o'clock a.m. on Wednesday, so the following morning. So some of these numbers might be a little bit different, but here we go. So there were some special elections in the state of Wisconsin and the state of Florida. I'll start with Wisconsin first, where the Democratic candidate, although it's supposed to be a nonpartisan election, but judge elections now are pretty partisan. But Susan Crawford beat the Republican MAGA-supported Elon Musk, giving him money, Donald Trump endorsed Brad Schimmel. She beat him for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So as a result, the Democrats are keeping control by 4-3 on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. One of the Democrats retired, so that's why they had this special election. So Trump and Musk put in all this time, all this effort. Musk literally put in $25+ million into this election. Him and his other political action committees. This was the most expensive one in our history. And Crawford won by about 10 points. I'm rounding a little bit. But it was like 55-45, the last numbers that I saw. So this was a good result for Democrats, of course. And a real blow to Trump and Musk and to the Republicans, because they were, at least some of them were pretty confident that Schimmel was going to win. Now, I wasn't. I actually thought Crawford was going to win this one. Now, 10 points, I wasn't sure it would be a 10-point victory given all the, money that Musk was putting into this. But, I was pretty hopeful she was going to win, and she did. So, but one of the things here, right, is 5 months ago, or thereabouts, we had the November election. Trump won the presidency. He won in Wisconsin. Okay, well, his candidate didn't win this time. This candidate got 45% of the vote. So, that's a good outcome. This election goes to show you how important, judicial elections now are now, because, courts are typically deciding cases because, when a state legislature or Congress passes laws, someone files a lawsuit because they don't like it, and the court system is the one that basically decides it. Either this U.S. Supreme Court or your state Supreme Court. So this is a good result. Though it's a shame that the system has come to this. Right? It's a lot more partisan than it used to be. Wisconsin delivered another victory for Democrats by re-electing the state superintendent of public instruction, Jill Underly, who won 52-48, so it was a little bit closer than the justice election was. So Underly beat a private charter school supporter in this. This is basically the person who kind of runs the educational system in Wisconsin. So good job, Wisconsin. You pulled through for the Democrats. Can't wait to hear how the Republicans are going to spin these losses. I mean, I'm sure they're going to try, but in the end, they lost, plain and simple. Now they're probably going to say, well, this was rigged somehow. I mean, that's their favorite excuse. Well, good luck trying to show that. You just got beat. Okay. Meanwhile, in Florida, there were 2 special elections for 2 House seats because they joined the Trump administration, or in one, it was Matt Gaetz who quit. I won't go into that backstory because I don't have enough time. But as expected, the Republicans won both of these heavily Republican districts in the state of Florida. So, but the good news here is the Democrats really cut into the 2024 election results. So in District 1, when Gaetz ran, he won 66-34% in November. So again, 5 months ago, thereabouts. So he won by about 32 points. The Republican won yesterday by only 15. So that was more than cut in half. And it's only been 5 months. It's not like this is 2 years. This is just 5 months later. You go from losing by 32 to losing by 15. So that's a pretty good, pretty big shift in 5 months. And in that particular election, the Democrat actually won a county that they hardly ever win. So even though they lost that election, they made inroads. That's a good sign. Similarly, in Florida's 6th district, so this was the seat that Mike Waltz had. He's the one that is in trouble with Signalgate. The one that set up the that group chat, right, with the reporter in. That guy. He won his election by 33 points in November 2024. Well, the Republican last night won by 14. So that's an even bigger shift. That's 19 points. Again, in just 5 months. So as a result of those 2 elections, the Republicans now have a 220 to 213 edge in the House because those seats were vacant, but now they're not going to be. So despite these losses, of course, the Democrats are claiming, well, they overperformed, than what they were kind of normally have been doing, which is great, I guess. But you still lost, right? You still lost by double digits. And one thing that the Democrats aren't telling you is that those candidates actually raised more money and spent more money than the Republicans did. And they still lost. But this just goes to show you how powerful gerrymandering is, right? Because these are heavily Republican districts. So even if you got a lot of money, like the Democrats had, they still got beat by double digits. But they really cut into the differential, which was 30 plus points just 5 months ago. So this goes to show you that people are rejecting Trump's and the Republicans' policies. It was just too much to overcome. But there's a lot of House races around the country that if the Democrats had lost previously in November by 15 points, they got a shot now if these numbers hold true in some other states. Right? So the Republicans again, they don't even though they won, they don't like these results because it's eating into their margins. And they're going to have to spend more money in some of these other districts than they might otherwise have had to. So those are the special elections that happened last night. Another thing that happened last night was Cory Booker just set the record for the longest filibuster in the history of the Senate. He went 25 hours and 4 minutes before he stopped. So he beat the old record of 24 hours and 18 minutes by Strom Thurmond, who tried to stop the Civil Rights Act bill in 1957. It's kind of ironic that Booker, a black person, is the one that beat Thurmond, who didn't want any black people to have anything to do with voting and running for government and all that sort of stuff. So during last night, I checked on YouTube, and there were, at least on one of the YouTube channels, there were 115,000 people watching his filibuster. And, of course, a lot of the independent sites on the Internet had, they had their own look-ins on some of these things, and some streaming services were there. But you hardly saw anything about this on the mainstream media, until he was getting close to breaking the record. I mean, some places didn't even say he was filibustering. Some of them didn't even say what a filibuster was and how it works and that kind of stuff. So, I can't resist criticizing mainstream media again. They just make it so easy. Senators Klobuchar and Smith, kudos to them. They, in the wee hours of Tuesday morning, were asking questions of Booker, to give him a break from talking. And this is something you can do under the rules of the Senate, as long as you stand up, and don't leave. And, other senators can ask you questions. And he did this for over 25 hours. So, man, he's got to be hurting after that. Oh. So here's my question for the Democrats. Who's next? Who's the next Democrat that's going to do a filibuster? They should coordinate doing this stuff and doing it as much as they can under the Senate rules. You got to muck it up in the Senate. Now, the House doesn't have a filibuster, so you can't do it in the House. It's just in the Senate. So, Chuck Schumer, let him filibuster more. Jeez. And I do have one quick update here about a case that the Court of Appeals ruled against the Trump administration in the case where they sent Venezuelans to El Salvador. So now that it's going to go to the Supreme Court, probably here at some point, and the Supreme Court is going to have to decide that one. And one of the guys the Trump administration has said, yeah, he shouldn't have been over there. But they're not going to go back and get him. What does that tell you about Trump and the GOP right now? Talk to you next week.